Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. So I think for me, the two things that I would have said were what we just talked about, sort of this collection of leaks and algorithmic sort of reverse engineering. And then the other one, which I'm about to talk about, is AI and ChatGPT. So ChatGPT obviously launched in November 2022. OpenAI had been around for a bunch of years before that. And that has really dramatically impacted the whole internet and all these technology companies. And I think, the remarkable thing, as we discussed prior to starting the recording, is that ChatGPT and to a lesser degree others have kind of created genuine competition for Google in a way that really hasn't existed for, you could argue, 15 or 20 years. Google has so dominated, Bing is there and Yahoo's there and you've got DuckDuckGo and all these guys, but they really have not moved the needle. But and so far, ChatGPT hasn't either from a traffic or search volume standpoint, but from all other indications, it is a bona fide competitor to Google. In the survey that we talked about last week that I did, 19% of people said they would use ChatGPT to the exclusion of Google if they were forced to make a choice. That's a big deal. And so, and there are other signals that indicate that. So this is something that also Google has been forced to respond to. Google was obviously the company that is sort of arguably responsible for the current generative AI phenomenon because of their research into transformers and other things that I can't really talk about with any kind of competence. But they have been forced to respond.
We decided earlier before the call that it didn't matter if you were competent or not. You can still talk about it.
Okay, all right. So Google has been responding to ChatGPT and to this competition. And in the absence of that, I think things would look very, very different than they do today. AI would still be here. Google would still be using it, but it would be less of a product. It would be less sort of B2B facing and consumer facing. I don't think we would see some of the things going on that are going on in the absence of that pressure. And so I think it's it's one of the big stories on the internet as a whole, and it's definitely a big story in search. So I think that that's my vote.
Yeah, it's a huge play, and as I pointed out, I think it's part of a much bigger picture that's evolving of information retrieval, how we do it, where we do it, when we do it, how it's satisfied, all of the consumer things, and also, as you've pointed out, verticalization. So let me just deal with the information retrieval side. This includes things like natural language processing, where all of a sudden my iPhone actually understands what I'm saying to it much better than it has before. It's much less brittle. I can get music, I can do HomeKit, I can get TV shows, all with natural language queries with a much higher rate of success. So that input is going to, and if it succeeds, both Android with Assistant and Apple, it's going to change how people interact with their phones because it's been problematic up to this point. It's worked in limited situations. So there's that part of AI that I think is significant. And ChatGPT has led that also. They're very good at that, right? If you've ever used their voice interface. The other is the LLMs and the generative part, which ChatGPT is good at, which Google is pretty good at. Apple is just taking baby steps in, but this stuff is all learnable. It just takes time. Then there's the other part of information retrieval, which are the knowledge graphs, which Google has a huge lead in that. ChatGPT has virtually nothing. Apple, surprisingly, has a large number of knowledge graphs. And then tying all that together with RAG and outputs and interfaces, creates this, what I see as a very dynamic environment going forward where there's, as you pointed out, a Venn diagram with Google, a lot of leading technologies and a lot of ability to have distribution on the phone, on the search page. ChatGPT with really great generative AI, and Apple with distribution and knowledge graphs and some generative capabilities. All of that creating, again, a very dynamic environment going forward that I think is different than we've seen for a long time.
So two points. One is that I think that the technologies that are behind what we're calling AI are decades and decades in development. There's a
Yes.
mix of things that have been improving over time for decades, and they've kind of come together in this moment to have what we have. And the other point is, we've seen Google react to competitive threats in the recent past. So that perceived sort of TikTok and social media as a threat in a certain way, because of the complaints that Google's results were crappy and there's more authenticity in social media. And so that led to the creation of all the you know
Visual.
well, some of that for sure, the endless parade of visual information or whatever. Um, the quote was, but also just all the forums, all the short videos, all of that stuff is a response to perceived competitive pressure. And then, um, you know, we just would not, the search results would just not look the way that they do, or wouldn't be moving in the direction that they're moving in the absence of ChatGPT. Google would be perfectly fine kind of keeping things as they were, you know, getting all the ad revenue that they're getting. I mean, it's sort of the complacency of the monopolist, right? And so competition has genuinely entered the market, and they're forced to innovate, and they're forced to respond to it. And I think that we would just be seeing a very different situation in the absence of ChatGPT and these other players that are similarly, putting putting out new stuff.
Yeah. So I'll say a couple things. I agree with you, Greg, that there's no way that Google search results would look as they increasingly do today, where you get AI overviews on much larger percentage of queries than you ever got. Earlier in the year. We're now in December of 2024. I don't think when all these were announced at Google I/O in May, June, you didn't see anything close to the level of AI overviews that you see today. So some of that is probably product testing, and some of it is the competitive threat of people are actually bailing on Google to go to ChatGPT. We need to do something about that. So I would say though that there's a couple additional comments I want to make. I think it's not just the complacency of the monopolist that's at play here, but it's also the innovator's dilemma. The fact
Yes,
that
for
Google
sure.
has so much of their revenue tied up in maintaining a certain interface for search, and there is absolutely no way that they would have upset that without real competitive pressure. And I still think that their revenues are substantially at risk from AI overviews, no matter how they decide to monetize. I don't see any way that they can maintain the same monetization that Prabhakar Raghavan has, sort of fine-tuned with, 82 dials over the last 7 or 8 years. I don't see that there's any way that they're going to be able to maintain that as the SERPs get more and more disrupted by what ChatGPT is doing. Now, of course, ChatGPT also is rumored to have an ad platform kind of in the works, so we'll see where
Yeah,
that leads. But
the enshittification.
enshittification, exactly. But the thing, Greg, you mentioned the sort of competitive threat of TikTok and other sort of visual platforms. I don't think that adequately captures the panic and the degree of response from Google on this. The only situation that I can sort of draw a parallel to is the massive effort and ultimate failure of Google Plus
Yeah,
in response to
Facebook.
Facebook eating more and more mobile time. And, obviously the social network of Google Plus was a massive failure, but the unification of all Google property accounts behind the scenes that required has set the stage for Google's dominance in advertising and targeting over the last decade since the sort of demise of Plus, right? So I think that level of panic where, you had entire buildings being taken over by Google Plus on the Mountain View campus, and you had every single team at Google being forced to get behind this unified login situation. That is the level of panic in Mountain View right now, from what I can tell on the outside, with respect to AI and AI overviews. And I think that you're starting to see, we're going to see AI in every single Google product, even if it's only a Wall Street story. I just think that there's that level of reaction to a true competitor, as you said, in ChatGPT. The final comment I wanted to make was on Mike. You and I think, sort of disagree on the importance of distribution here moving forward. I basically don't think it's that big a deal. And frankly, if you look at the brand search data from Rand and Ahrefs, the percentage of brand searches happening on Google, that is a unnecessary piece of friction, right? There's no reason that consumer doesn't just have some e-commerce company's app on their phone, or can't just type in the name of the website into their browser. But it's just easy enough to just use Google to do that. And I see that as a sort of pretty tight parallel to it's perfectly easy to open the ChatGPT app on my phone, on my Apple phone. And I'm not sure that like having Spotlight search integrated with ChatGPT and all that, like, and all of the Apple knowledge graphs and everything else, like, I'm not sure that that's like such a major positive benefit for me that I'm going to default to using whatever Apple's intelligence is moving forward versus just opening the ChatGPT app to do my searching. So I actually think that ChatGPT is in pretty good shape right now, where they've got 300 million weekly active users. Again, I think that their product has come light years in the last 2 years in terms of quality, and the local search experience that I sort of tested out with Search GPT, and increasingly seems to just be sort of merging into the main product, that I tested in late October, I think is quite good. And I think it's only going to get better. And like I said, I just don't see the benefit of the sort of cognitive friction of opening the app versus doing a search sort of natively in Siri or Android or whatever. Like, I just don't see that as a major hurdle for them.
I don't see it as a hurdle. I just see it as a wedge. And I see user behavior as changing slowly over time, much like we've changed our credit card behavior slowly over time. Credit card is not a big interface issue either, but behaviors have changed around it, and credit cards are struggling to keep that behavior on card. And the phones are stealing that behavior because it's easier, or the watch is stealing it. And I see the same thing happening with search over time. I'm looking at a 4 or 5 year time frame here. And currently I am experimenting with this question of Siri to ChatGPT or ChatGPT to ChatGPT. And surprisingly, Siri is winning for me. Now, again, I'm more heavily engaged with voice on my phone than probably 99% of people in this world, because I use it on my TV, I use it on my music, I use it everywhere in my car. But I do see it as a wedge that Apple can leverage. And if the results are, and some things like sports, which we've talked about, you don't want to go to the app. You don't just want a minor update. So there are queries that lend themselves to this. And the question is whether that's enough to change user behaviors over time. My bet is 4 years out here, David, but I'll put a beer on it, that it is. Assuming, and this leads to your DMA conversation, assuming that governments don't intervene with Apple and Google and prevent the integration of these features into the OS.
So I wanted to say two things before we move on to the next section. One is back to your innovator's dilemma point, David, which I think is entirely valid. One of the aspects of the innovator's dilemma for Google is how much do they invest in Gemini as a consumer-facing tool. They've got 5 versions of Gemini now, and they're all sort of slightly different. I did the same local query against all of them, and it came out with it was a different output. It was really interesting. Some of them had maps, some of them had links, others did not. But Gemini could become its own competitor to Google search. And that's what my survey data has shown also, is that there's a simpler, sort of cleaner UI over there. If the data on the back end is the same, why not use, Gemini? So that's one aspect of it. And then just speaking as a focus group of,
with 5 versions of it, it reminds me of Chat. Google Chat, right? It's like, why do we have 5 versions? And I looked at it the other day and I'm thinking, oh my God, how do I pick one?
Right. And so that's a problem for consumers, is that you don't, it has a default setting, and maybe that's what people will use. But just as a focus group of one, in my own case, the way that I use Google has radically changed. So I use ChatGPT as a kind of primary tool. I'm using it all day long. Google is something I'm using interstitially to get specific kinds of information, something I know exists, or to navigate to a particular site. I'm not using it as in the way that I did before, and it's a backup tool for me now. It's not the primary thing I go to. I use ChatGPT and Perplexity, and to some degree Claude, and even Gemini now. And Google is kind of a backup, kind of cleanup tool. That somebody sent me an article on Apple News. I need the URL. I'll strip it and put it into Google and click on the publication link. Get that kind of use case. So my own behavior has radically changed organically, not ideologically. I'm not using these because I hate Google. I'm using them because they're effective, because they're more
maybe
successful. No.
Well, no, but Greg, you bring up a really good point in terms of corporate strategy for Google. I absolutely think they should be doubling and tripling down on Gemini as a discrete brand that people should be using instead. Like, compare Gemini to ChatGPT. Don't compare Google to ChatGPT. I think Google's looking ahead 5 years. Like, I guess I would predict, or maybe even longer, but some time horizon. I think Google will be in the position in search today that Facebook is in social media, like Facebook, the website, Facebook, the app, right? Where Meta has a ton of social data and everything else based on Instagram and WhatsApp. Those are still absolutely crushing it. But Facebook is basically a, right-wing echo chamber for people over 65.
Well, it still has a lot of usage, but there's a sense in which it's kind of moribund, really, I think.
Right. So I feel like that would actually be a smart, intentional strategy on Google's part if it's sort of
legacy business.
Put Google into maintenance mode and put all of its chips on Gemini. I think it's very clear that that's where the market is moving.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what I've been saying here, David. I mean, from a different standing, but I think that's exactly what's happening, is that search as a destination, Google search as a destination, will decline dramatically for various reasons.
But it's not, to Greg's point, so it will decline. I'm not disputing that comment either. But to Greg's point, like, he is still going to Google for certain types of searches. And I guess that's what I'm saying. I think we as consumers are going to be more likely to sort of pick and choose where we go for certain types of searches. And it's really not that much cognitive friction once we've established a behavior pattern to do that, right? It's the same reason people are Googling Facebook to get into their Facebook account.
Well, and local is one of the areas of to your point about knowledge graphs, Mike. Local is an area of it's the competitive differentiator for Google at this point. Yes. And so far nobody has really been able to match what Google has in local, and they may not be. So that may be an area where local SEOs still need to really primarily focus on Google because it has the best version of that kind of going forward. We'll see.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at earmedia.co. We'll see you next week.